our next speaker. Failure is always an option. Mr. Art Tomassetti, Colonel retired Art Tomassetti, served for 27 years in the United States Marine Corps, Semper Fi. He earned his commission in 1986 and completed flight training in 1988. Colonel Tomassetti attended the U.S. Navy Test Pilot School and was assigned to the Joint Strike Fighter Test Force after graduation, one of my favorite aircraft. He eventually became the lead government pilot for the X-35 test team and the only U.S. government pilot to fly all three variants of the X-35 aircraft. Upon retirement from the Marine Corps, Colonel Tomassetti worked for Lockheed Martin Aeronautics as the F-35B U.S. Marine Corps Program Manager. Since 2019, Colonel Tomassetti is a motivational speaker and the owner of Time to Climb Training and Consulting. I got one last thing to say about you, Colonel. He is a fellow and past president of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, the current chairman of the Flight Test Safety Committee, and a recipient of the Tony Levier, okay, there's not a French accent on that, Flight Test Safety Award. Mr. Tomassetti.
Now, there we go. All right. Thanks very much for having me here. Can I ask a question before I get started, though? I assume you all do these safety days every year, right? So who was at last year's Safety Day? Show of hands. Okay. Since last year's Safety Day, have you done anything dangerous? Have you been safe? Yeah? So hang on, come here. You said that since last year's Safety Day, you've been safe?
Sure.
Sure? So you came just to see me today. That's awesome. Here, your next cup of coffee's on me. All right. Love it when people come just to see me. Okay, so that's me. Oh, wow, you really can't see the slides from up here. And I got to flip. So that's me. That's also me. Yes, there is a story. No, I won't tell you what it is. So here's your trailer, your preview, your thing. Blimps, cask of ale, Iron Maiden. Now, see, that's got to keep your interest till the end of this, at least. Okay.
In the world of flight test, there are two possible outcomes, one that everyone seeks and one they avoid. These are those options.
How many Law and Order fans out there? A couple? All right, so you know what we're doing. Success and failure. That's pretty much the only two choices you've got. Unless you grew up in the 80s as a kid, went to the arcade, and Asteroids was your game, you had this option, but that was only for like advanced users. So generally speaking, you've only got those two.
We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
Okay, so Kevin was right. Ed Harris really is a badass, isn't he? So if Gene Kranz is right, and that's not an option, and this is the shortest speech in Safety Day history, because I'm done, right? But, you know, and here's a funny thing. I've given this talk before, and I always start off with the Gene Kranz was wrong. And last night I'm sitting going over my notes and said, so I'm going to walk into a NASA facility tomorrow full of NASA people, and I'm going to tell them Gene Kranz got it wrong. That doesn't seem like a good idea. That could also lead to the shortest presentation in Safety Day history. So let's just hypothetically entertain for a moment that maybe Gene wasn't 100% right. Because we all know that even though we want the one that starts with S, the one that starts with F happens. That was supposed to be just a very simple photo opportunity. That was an unsinkable ship. So failure happens. So it's weird how my ideas for talks come to me, right? So I'm watching TV and I'm flipping through the channels, and I don't know, you still say flipping through the channels? Or scrolling through the channels, I guess, nowadays. And I happen to catch the movie The Right Stuff right about the time Apollo 13, right about the time where Ed Harris makes that quote. And I had this idea about talking about success and failure, and that same week, a couple of other things happened. I got an email from someone who was a fan of the podcast that I do, and they sent me this historical document. And then I happened to be later that week at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. And all those things kind of aligned to give me the idea of how to go about talking about success and failure. And I thought, why not let history walk us down that path and show us some examples of success and failure? So if we're going to talk about history, we got to go back in time, right? And if you're going to go back in time, you got to do it in style. You got to break out the DeLorean and fire up the flux capacitor and plug in your date. So to talk about success, we're going to go back to 1957. Let me introduce you to the U.S. Navy's non-rigid airship ZPG-2, affectionately known as the Snowbird. See, coming out of World War II, the Navy had tried some things with airships. And here in the late 50s, there's a couple of missions where these things might really have an opportunity to play a role. There's missions like airborne early warning and anti-submarine warfare. These missions that require persistence, things that can stay up for a long period of time in any kind of weather. So persistence and endurance were the key. And they thought maybe airships are the answer. So they went down the path and they built a couple of these different types of airships. Now, these aren't small. This is almost 350 feet long. It's called a non-rigid airship because it's basically a giant bag of gas, right? And the control car, or the thing where all the people do their stuff in, hangs underneath. And the control car for the ZPG-2, depending on what equipment configuration you put in there, anywhere from 15 to 25 people, but pretty tight quarters. And if you are trying to prove to people that your air vehicle can do this persistence and endurance mission, what better way to do it than go on a really, really long flight? And that's what they decided to do. We're going to go on a really, really long flight. So in March of 1957, they took off out of Boston, and they flew that route you see up there. They didn't stop for gas. Put your gas in the engine kind or the gas in the bag kind. They didn't stop at McDonald's. They didn't stop for food. They didn't stop for any of those things. They did have to take on water for ballast every now and again. And that's kind of an interesting contraption they lowered into the water to do that. But that was a continuous circuit, and they landed 11 days later. And when they landed, the then Chief of Naval Operations, Arleigh Burke, sent them this message. And he basically said, hey, congrats, you guys just did something awful. You just broke and set a new world endurance record for airships. Because that's another thing, right? If you're going to go do a demonstration and try to convince people that you've got something that's worth investing in, why not go break a record or set a new record doing it? The previous record for airships was set in 1929, so almost 30 years before, 1929, by the Graf Zeppelin that flew 6,980 miles. The Snowbird on that route that I showed you did 9,500 miles. Not only did they break the record, they kind of shattered the record. The endurance previous record was 200 hours. They did 264 hours. So I started thinking about, how did they pull that off? And this is where that second piece of evidence that I mentioned, that second catalyst for me coming up with this idea, this historical document that I was sent is from a Mr. Moore, who was the field service rep for Goodyear, so a tech rep kind of person. He was the only civilian on board the ZPG-2 for that flight. And what he wrote was it's somewhere between a journal and a flight test report, right? He kind of kept track. There's some technical stuff in there. But one of the things he said that really struck me is he talks about all of the planning that went into trying to make this event a success. And it says there they used all the time to prevent any incident that might cause the success of the flight to be jeopardized. So they actively went after stopping failure from happening. That's a key point. There's another document I came across, and this is from the youngest member of the crew, one of the Navy members of the crew, Frank Maximilian. And he's talking about, in his journal, how concerned they are with weight. Now, you can imagine, right? You got this airship that's got to float in the air, right? Very sensitive to things like weight. So they were meticulous. They weighed everything that went on board the ship. They limited the crew on what they could take. They even said, hey, we know you're going to shave, so we're not going to put water on board for you to shave. We're going to make sure everyone goes out and buys electric razors. I didn't even know they had electric razors back at the time, but apparently they did. Now, our young sailor here, his idea was, well, why don't we just not shave for the 2 weeks? But apparently back in the day, that was not going to fly with the United States Navy. So when you sort of unpack this thing, and you start looking at what's the recipe for success, it's stuff we're all familiar with. They did extensive planning. They did extensive preparation. They did training. They were a hand-selected crew. They knew that they were going to be flying through some, pretty significant weather in the northern part of that route in the North Atlantic. So they went out and they did dedicated adverse weather testing. This flight record here, that's the 12 flights they did just to go out and do icing testing. So they understood how that airship would perform in those conditions. But I've shown you just about everything I was able to find out about that success story. Because what happens when we have success? Well, we take the thing, and if it's too big to fit in the museum, we cut off a piece that can fit in the museum, and we move it to the museum so that people can go look at the thing that had the success because it's still around. And this is where that third part of that week, that catalyst came in. I happened to go to the Pensacola Naval Aviation Museum where you can actually see that forward portion of the control car for the snowboard and touch it. If you do go there and you touch it and anyone yells at you, don't tell them I told you it was okay to touch it. I didn't see any sign, so I touched it. And of course, I took my selfie while I was there because you got to take a selfie. All right. So that's the easy one. So let's talk about the harder one, failure. We're going to jump back in our DeLorean here, and we're going to go back a little bit further to 1930. Now, I've got to kind of sort of set the stage here for you of what's going on in this period of time in the United Kingdom. This is a painting by a gentleman named Montague Black. And he painted this in 1926, and it was what he thought the world, what London would look like in the year 2026, so 3 years from now. But it's maybe a little hard to see from the back, but you notice airships figured prominently in what he thought the future was going to look like. Now, at that time also, the British Empire was still the British Empire, right? They had stuff all over the planet. And when you have an empire, one of the things you got to do is you got to keep that empire connected somehow. So one of the ideas they had was, hey, what if we had airships that could connect our empire, right? That would be really, really cool. So I now introduce you to the rigid airship R101. So as part of this Imperial Air scheme, they set out to build these giant rigid air ships. Now, rigid means and we'll talk about some of the differences in a little bit, but it's not just a giant bag of gas anymore. It's a little bit more to it than that. And in the beginning, they actually built two. The R101 you see pictured here was built by the government. The R100, the sister ship, was built by private industry. And just to give you an idea of scale, so that when we just talked about the Navy Snowbird, there's the R101 in comparison as best I could do to scale in PowerPoint. And if you're curious, that's the Boeing 747. It's 3 of those and then some. So it's big. And a rigid airship means you've got this, basically this solid, this steel structure, these ribs basically, the inside of which are these giant bags of gas. But all of the stuff where you put the people and the equipment is inside of that structure. Now, in order to connect the empire, you got to be able to carry stuff. You got to be able to carry people. You need to be able to carry payload. So these were designed as passenger carrying airships. And they were extremely elegant, designed to carry about 50 passengers and around 40-ish crew. It kind of is like an ocean liner, right, of the day. It sort of has that feel to it. I mean, they even had a smoking room where you could go have your evening cigar. A smoking room on a giant airship filled with hydrogen gas. That's okay. They lined that room with asbestos, so there was no worries. You know, they did their risk mitigation stuff, right? And like the Snowbird, in order to prove that you can go do these long distance flights, well, maybe you should go do a long distance flight. So even in the early stages, when this whole idea was being developed, there was a plan for one of the airships to do a United Kingdom to India run as a demonstration flight. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, Turbo, they had airplanes and they had ocean liners back then. Why would you want to go do that in an airship? Well, that day, the Royal Air Service could get you from London to Karachi in 8 days, one way, with 21 layovers. 21 layovers. Okay, I don't even like stopping at DFW for one layover anymore. 21 layovers. You got to be, and no app to see if your the next flight's on time, right? Ocean liner, 3.5 weeks to do that. The airship was going to get you there one way, 5 days, coming back 6 days because of the winds. One stop in Egypt, most likely. So actually a better way to travel back then. Like the Snowbird, they had a hand-selected crew, the best of the airship business in the UK at the time. And they did flight tests. Now, there's an interesting thing, because they, like the Snowbird, who did some flight tests, found some things were wrong, found the thing was a little bit too heavy, had to go do some weight savings. They ran into the same sort of issues with the R101. They did some flight tests, realized that the ship was a little too heavy. They had to do some reconfigurations. They actually did 2 major mods of the airship. I've circled the flights they did in configuration 1, and there's the flights they did in configuration 2. And then in the final configuration, after the most extensive modification they had done on the airship, they did one check flight before setting off for India. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't seem like a great idea, right? No, it doesn't. Why on earth would they do that? Well, here's why on earth they would do that. So here's the calendar, October 20th. Who knows what happens on October 20th? Ooh, so I don't have to give away my other Starbucks card. Good. Okay, I didn't know what happened on October 20th. But on October 20th in the UK, there is this big international air conference, right? And this guy, Lord Thompson, who is the Secretary of Air, the Minister of Air, whatever you want to call it, he's going to attend that conference. He is a huge proponent of airships. And he thinks it would be a really cool idea if he could show up at that conference having just completed this flight to India and back on the R101. He says, I must insist, excuse if you don't speak British, I'll translate here. I must insist on the program for the India flight being adhered to, as I have made my plans accordingly. Right? So, in order for that to work, they set a date. We're going to leave this date because we said, okay, it's going to take 5 days to get there. We want 4 days for him to do whatever he's got to do in India, 6 days to get back, and we want a little bit of buffer. So we got to take off on September 26th. Okay, pushing it a little close to the limit, but all right, that could possibly work. But guess what? That mod takes a little bit longer than anybody thought it was going to take. That last mod they did, and that never happens anymore, right? So they don't even get the airship out of the mod until September 26th. And then they've got issues with weather and winds and some paperwork stuff. They don't even really get an opportunity to fly for the first time until October 1st. On October 2nd, after they finished that check flight, Lord Thompson says, hey, look, I realize what I said back in July, but just because I'm standing here with all my bags packed and my entourage here and our tickets for India in hand, don't feel like you got to do anything out of the ordinary. 24 hours before they're going to go take off. And they end up taking off on the 4th. And do you know why they took off on the 4th? Well, if you run that 15-day timeline out, got to take off by the 4th in order to make it. Seven hours after takeoff, this is what comes from the R101.
After an excellent supper, our distinguished passengers smoked a final cigar, and having sighted the French coast, have now gone to bed to rest after the excitement of their leave-taking. All essential services are functioning satisfactorily. The crew have settled down to watch-keeping routine.
Now, that wasn't really the message. That would have been cool if I could have got you the real thing, but I don't speak Morse code. That was a AI-generated thing, because you can have AI generate just about anything you want nowadays. And again, if you're a person of the 80s like me, you realize that Skynet, Terminator is just like next week, probably, right? Okay, so let me walk you through what happens in the next several minutes. At 7 hours after takeoff, they're over the coast of France. The weather is not good. They took off in marginal weather, and it's only continued to get worse. But we might ask, why are they even flying in the first place? Well, they had a flight clearance, right? And you need a flight clearance to go fly. But guess what? This flight clearance was phoned in on the morning of October 1st so they could go do that check flight. The people who wrote the flight clearance, or the airworthiness certificates as they were called then, the people who wrote those were in London. And they were mostly airplane, fixed-wing airplane people. All of the airship smart people were in Cardington, and that's where the R101 took off from. So anytime the certifiers, the flight clearance issuers, didn't understand something, they called down to Cardington, the people who were running the R101 program, and asked if it all was okay. Doesn't seem quite right. They did hire some independent consultants, right, to go look at this. And I laughed when I read this, because it says in the bottom, and again, I'll translate if you don't speak British, it says a good deal of general thinking and comparison on limited information has been required in reaching our conclusion. And we have not had time, since receiving essential information from the Royal Air Works, to prepare a sufficiently consistent report, or consistent written report. We are proceeding to put our first draft into final form. So basically saying, we didn't get a lot of details. We don't really understand what you provided us. So we've just used some of our general smarts to make an assessment. And we're writing up a draft that we'll get to you. They were still writing that draft on the morning that the R101 took off. So just a little bit after 2 a.m., the watch has just changed. So they've got the next watch crew on. They don't report anything going on out of the ordinary with the airship. But a tear appears in the front cover up by the nose of the airship. And no one realizes that this happens. And I mentioned that they were flying in adverse weather. Now, you know, the winds in this weather, 30 to 40 knots, but the airship's also moving at like 40 knots as well. So you've got basically hurricane force winds. Now that that cover has been torn off, hitting those forward gas bags and tears a hole in the two forward ones, we believe. And again, this is all speculation, a lot of it based on some reports from the survivors and so on. So let's talk about these gas bags for a minute. They're big. And at the time, the gas bags are made out of cow insides. All right, we just had lunch. So cow insides. They take the cow inside pieces and they flatten them out and they put some stuff on them, and little old ladies working someplace in a factory there sew them together. They're big, so they take a lot of cows to make one of these gas bags, right? But they're problematic. They leak, and in every one of those mods that was done, they had to make the gas bags bigger. The gas bags, now bigger, are not tightly secure inside of that airship, so they're rubbing against the ribs and the structure occasionally. In fact, one of the inspectors who was responsible for contributing to that airworthiness submitted a report and actually says, I cannot recommend to you the extension of the present permit to fly or issue of any other further permit or certificate. He basically says, I can't say it's okay for this thing to fly. That sounds like somebody trying to use the no vote to me. And I'm pretty familiar with the no vote. I talk about it quite a bit. So he submits that report. That report goes up to mid-management in London. And what does London do? Gas bags? Hey, they get on the whatever communications device and they call down to Cardington, to the R101 people. And they said, hey, our guy just said your stuff is dangerous. What do you think? Nah, it's not. It's okay. That doesn't seem right. Okay, so now we've lost gas from those two forward bags. We've got a big hole in the nose of the ship. Water from the storm is pouring in there. The ship at about 2:06 goes into its first dive. And this is where they start to realize something is gone wrong. Should they have known that bad things can happen? Well, they had a plan to do adverse weather testing. They just ran out of time and never got to do it. They had a plan to do speed trials to see how the airship would handle, how the cover and the materials would handle at high speeds. They just never got around to doing it because they ran out of time. They ran out of time because they had to be back in order for the Secretary of Air to be at that conference on October 20th. When they interviewed people afterwards, they said the program of tests drawn up by the captain were never complete. So now it's a little after 2:07. Now they're dumping ballast. They're trying to use the flight controls to get the ship out of the dive and trying to stabilize it. But weight is becoming a significant issue. And let's talk about that for a minute. As we mentioned with the Navy Snowbird, weight. They knew weight was a big deal, right? They weighed everything that went on board that ship for that transatlantic flight. They told the crew, go buy electric razors because we don't even want to carry the weight of the water for you to shave. In that first configuration, when you figure in what the structure weighs and you add in all the equipment and the crew and everything, that very bottom number, the payload, that's the useful part, that's the people and stuff you can carry, that's where they were at. They were in the red. They made that second mod, which was basically they made those gas bags bigger and they shaved a lot of weight out of the airplane. It got better, but they were still in the red. So on that third mod, they basically cut the airship in half, extended it 45 feet, and added another gas bag in there. And that finally got them some useful payload. But it's not much useful payload. So if weight is such a concern, you would do things like, hey, we're going to tell the crew and the passengers you're only allowed to bring so much stuff, right? Seems to make sense. Seems like a good idea. Unless you were a VIP passenger. So if you were a VIP passenger, you got to bring casks of ale. You got to bring a ceremonial carpet to do ceremonial stuff on, whatever that might be. And of course, you got to bring champagne. Now, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like the kind of guys you want to go party with on the weekend, but if weight is such a concern, what on earth are we doing? So just before 208, airship, they've done everything they can do. They've dumped ballast. Now they make a decision to go and dump emergency ballast, right? Now, to me, anything that is emergency, like I grew up in airplanes where like emergency things had these yellow and black slashed markings on them, right? So you knew in case of emergency, that's what you should go do, right? So, and usually they were something you could reach pretty easily in the cockpit of the airplane. Well, the emergency ballast drop for the R101 was not located in the control car. There was a release up in the nose, and 770 some odd feet back, there was another one in the tail. And the way you enacted that emergency system was you got on the internal communication and you told someone, go run and press the emergency thing in the front or in the back. So they did that. Rigger Church, one of the survivors of the crash, he would unfortunately die of his injuries later. He says he got the order to go and do that, but before he could make that run to the front, they had impacted the ground. So at just after 208, the airship final dive impacts the ground at about 18 degrees nose down and 13 miles an hour. Survivable, but one of those forward engines gets twisted. Spark from somewhere ignites that giant ship filled with hydrogen gas. 6 people out of the 54 on board survived. As with most failures, we spend a lot of time analyzing what went wrong, and there is an extremely lengthy report about what went wrong for the R101. A couple of things of interest, right? This is from the first officer, one of the survivors. And I'm going to read this to you because I think this really helps to understand the mindset. Everybody is rather keyed up now, as we all feel that the future of airships very largely depends on what sort of show we put up. There are many unknown factors, and I feel that the thing called luck will figure rather conspicuously in our flight. Let's hope for good luck and do our best. I don't know much, But I'm here to tell you, if your risk mitigation strategy includes the words hope and luck, you are doing it wrong, okay? They also said, and this was talking, remember I mentioned there was a sister ship, the R100. They asked the captain of the R100, what do you think? And he basically said that he believed that they made decisions that were not good decisions based on trying to meet that deadline that was set in front of them. Now, of course, we want to know, well, why on earth were they using hydrogen, right? Well, if you do the math with helium, which was a much safer substance, doesn't get you where you need to be, right? And also, helium at that point in time, they don't make helium in the United Kingdom. They make that in the United States of America. And it ain't cheap to make, and it ain't cheap to ship. Hydrogen is cheap and plenty available. And this is, so as I'm doing the research in this, I'm finding all this interesting stuff. This is the press release, right? We're carrying passengers on an experimental flight with the object of testing out the behavior of the airship. Somebody mentioned in the previous lecture, no unnecessary people on board, right? Doesn't seem like a good idea. So that crash pretty much ended the dream of airships for the UK. That sister ship I mentioned, the R100, it was in the hangar being modded when this happened. Never came out of the hangar. What was left of the R101 in that field in France and what was left of the R100 were sold as scrap metal. And in the, boy, this is a really weird world we live in. A lot of that scrap metal, duraluminum, was bought by the Graf Zeppelin company. That is one of the materials that went into the production of one of their airships, the LZ-129, which you know better as the Hindenburg. And we know what happens 7 years later with this particular airship. I was amazed at the impact in pop culture that this incident had. The music you're listening to is from Iron Maiden, heavy metal band Iron Maiden, right? And the words you saw there talks about 1,000,001 chance, right? Hope, luck, not great strategies. So, you know, it would be great if I could give you something like Gene Kranz and just say, failure is not an option. Go forth and do. But I'm not in command anymore. Look, at my house, I'm second in command most days. And there's my wife, there's me and the dog. And I say most days because some days I'm not sure between the dog and I. So I can't tell you that. All I can suggest is be mindful that failure, it wants to happen. It really does. You got to do stuff to stop it from happening. When you got to make a choice between those two, know that that bottom one is always trying to happen unless you try to do stuff to stop it, because that's the only way you're going to get to the top one. I'm going to do this quick. That sister ship, the R100, because I hate ending on that really down note, it made a transatlantic flight. It went from London to Canada successfully. But you know what? It had the same issues. It had issues with the cover and the fabric that they found out during some of their adverse weather and high-speed testing. They did endurance flights and learned stuff. They modded the airplane and went out and tested and did it again. And that happened 3 months before. So you could say that maybe that Navy airship had success because they learned from the failure of the R101, and that's kind of what we do, right? We do a good job, I think, when failures happen of trying to extract what we can out of those and communicate that so that it doesn't happen to other people. So maybe that failure led to the success, but how come the success of the R100 3 months before didn't help prevent the failure of the R101? And I think it's because we don't spend a lot of time figuring out why things went right. And maybe we should spend a little bit more time getting more out of our successes so we can prevent failures. Thank you for your time.
Hey, Colonel Tomassetti, thank you for that brief. I don't think we have anything in CIO, okay? But we do have a question from another speaker. I like that.
Yeah, I've got a question, and it relates to the Thai cave rescues in Thailand, where the British cave rescue guys brought the 12 kids and the coach out. And so it's that bit of actually luck and hope. There was a lot of luck involved in that. So it's that bit of maximizing where you can, but sometimes hope and luck, if you're in an extreme situation, luck and hope are in that, which is not in the corporate space, but if you're in an emergency space, sometimes luck and hope are the only things you can deal with. So that's good. Thank you.
No, I agree. I'm here today because luck happened, right? Here's the only thing about luck, though, is you can't make luck happen. It happens, if it will or it won't. You can't bet on it. So do everything you can so that if it does happen, it's a bonus at the end of the day.
With that one question, right, you said you're here today because of luck. What's that story?
So there's three, all right? And I'll tell you the one that's probably the most relatable, because the airplane ones, we all who fly understand that. Sophomore year of college, I'm home on break, just come back from getting a haircut, and pull out of an intersection, or pull into an intersection from the shopping center, and the next thing I know, there's a paramedic knocking on the window of the car. Somehow the car was in 3 spins. Drunk driver ran the red light, hit right where the driver's front tire of the car was. Half a Mississippi time difference, and he impacts the driver's door where I am. That half a Mississippi was because I stopped to get a mint leaving the haircut, I think. Luck, fate, I don't know. Half of Mississippi isn't a lot of margin, but something happened that day.
Right. So did you invest in that company that make mints?
No, I didn't invest in that company. I tell you, everywhere I go and there's mints, I always take one now.
One last question, and we did get one, and it's a pretty good question, so I'm going to ask it to you. What is your opinion on perhaps non-H-2 airships for future applications in sustainable air transportation?
Yeah, I think we're finding out, right? If you're paying attention to what's going on in aviation, there is a lot. It's cool, right? It's kind of like that 50s time frame almost. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. I think we're going to find out that, hey, there is some practical use for something that can stay up that is kind of low energy to do that. We have a lot of reasons where something that persists in the air comes in handy. There's military applications, commercial applications, civilian applications. So I think we're going to continue to see people go down that path.
Copy. Good copy. Hey, another round of applause for Colonel Tomassetti. Thank you, sir.